This talk is based on some consulting work that I did up until about 12 years ago. We never followed up with the proper research project. I tried to get funding for it and failed. So this is going to be just kind of a qualitative overview of a small deposit that I've always thought was kind of interesting. But we're just mostly going to be looking at pictures here. It's the VW zone in Junior Lake property in Ontario, which belongs to Landor Resources. And it's an example, I think, of a small hydrothermal nickel deposit formed in these Archean volcanic rocks. So we're sitting here in the Superior province. The property's up here in the middle of Ontario. The rocks are around 2.7 billion years old. I'm not aware of any geochronology from the immediate area, and the age doesn't really matter that much. The host rocks here in green are this the greenstone belt. They're arc rhyolites, a small amount of rhyolite, lots of tholeiitic basalts, and volcaniclastic sediments, iron formations, cherts, conglomerates. There's a major fault running through the middle of this property here. And this is the scale here. There's 5 kilometers, so it's a fairly big land position they've got. They've got a number of gold deposits and showings associated with this very big structural feature, and they've put most of their interest and attention on those gold, the gold system. So there hasn't been a whole lot of work done on this nickel deposit, although there is a 43101 resource estimate. There's this younger ferropicritic glomeroporphyritic gabbro intrusive suite. There's a big sill here that cuts across this greenstone belt. And the VW deposit that we're talking about here is in the footwall to that. And it may be associated with what's called here the B47 nickel copper deposit, which is shown here in the middle of the sill, but it's actually right on the bottom. And then, as you always see in these systems, it's folded down in among these either coeval or perhaps in some cases younger TTG type felsic plutonic suites. So I'll show you the resource first. They drilled many kilometers of core into this thing. They set up a mine model with 3 little open pit shells and a lot of more mineralization underground that may or may not be accessible to mining. And you can see here the resource in the mining model is only about 1 million tons, containing a little more than 0.5% nickel, very small amount of copper, cobalt, and trace amounts of the PGEs as well. And here are some wireframes showing, this is in plan view, that there's a number of mineralized horizons here. See the amount of drilling that was done. And the total mass enclosed in these wireframes, which encircle the 0.2% nickel cutoff grade, is about 6 million tons. So it's not a trivial deposit, but it's certainly not huge. Here's another plan view from the deposit model, and the little blocks here are the domains that were calculated with grades indicated by color. And the point here, I just want to show you that, again, there's a number of these planar, steeply dipping domains, and there's quite a difference in grade sometimes from one of these mineralized zones to another. This one, for instance, has got much higher nickel grades than the one right next to it. And the best grades seem to be near the south, which is on the bottom of the system. Here's a cross-section showing the same kind of data. And these domains, again, they're separate panels. And there's a tendency for the higher grades to be down here along the southern margin. But these are not all the same planar structure. They're different ones in the same general location within the system. And in some cases, the grade seems to be loaded on the top of each of these horizons. Here's a geological cross-section that I drew up based on logging some of the drill holes This is near the east end of the whole system. And I think it's probably a homoclinal sequence, but it's been very strongly deformed. The amount of flattening in these rocks is pretty extreme. Aspect ratios are probably in the order of at least 10 to 1. But as far as I could tell, at the bottom here, we have this carbonate-rich mafic and ultramafic schist, which I think started out its existence as komatiite or dunitic komatiite cumulates. And then a sequence of tuffs, mafic tuffs, lava flows, intercalated tuffs, a cherty sulfide silicate iron formation horizon, which sort of marks the base of the mineralized area in the system. More tuffs and sediments, one of these glomeroporphyritic sills cutting across the whole thing. And in orange here is the mineralized domain. And it's a brecciated picritic basalt. And I've never been quite sure exactly what we were looking at, but they kind of look like flow-top breccias, except in most cases there isn't a flow, so they might be transported picritic basalt hyaloclastite type breccias. And then in this section, just down at the very bottom, where these brecciated picrites were a little bit thicker, there was a zone of more coherent looking picritic and pyroxenitic material that starts to show some higher magnesium contents, and which has got a rather distinctive alteration style that I'll show you. So this is what these brecciated picritic basalts look like. This is one of the exceptionally well-preserved bits. We've got these fragments here that are very fine-grained. They're aphanitic. In thin section, they just look like very fine-grained basalts. And then the matrix around them is mafic, but also contains quite a lot of carbonate material, and I think it's some sort of tuffaceous infilling. And this, as you saw in the first slide, this kind of material has a sort of a fissured, deeply weathered aspect where this has just been scraped off in a trench, but where it was exposed at surface, it was quite deeply weathered, rusty, really pretty ugly looking rock. In thin section, this stuff here, now here's a whole thin section scanned, so that's about 1.5 inches long. And you can see in this case that the fragments of picritic basalt are quite small here. And as I mentioned, they're really flattened. You know, each of these little lenses here is probably one fragment of this probably hyaloclastite breccia, which has been squashed to a very, very high aspect ratio. This is what it looks like in drill core. You can see this very strong fabric. And within the basaltic fragments, we see typical assemblage of tremolite chlorite, a little bit of plagioclase and some leucoxene. And there's a lot of carbonate quartz and biotite veining. And this sort of brownish stain here is due to the presence of chlorite and biotite, often on the margins of these little clasts. And the volume between the clasts is filled up with the mixture of carbonate, minerals, sulfides, and biotite. Here's another example of that. So this is this fractured and flattened picritic basalt with the sulfides sitting in the interstitial volume along with some carbonate minerals. There's quite often biotite in here as well. This could be phlogopite. We haven't done microprobe work on it. I call it biotite in the field. And then you've got the sulfides in here together with the carbonates. And then on the SEM, I did a little bit of SEM work on this and found that these sulfides are dominated by pyrite and pentlandite. So the pyrite's the one here with the nice polish. The pentlandite is all flaky. And there's a little bit of pyrrhotite in there as well. This point here is pyrrhotite, surrounded by the gang minerals like biotite, carbonate, tremolite. There's a little bit of nickel in the pyrite and the pyrrhotite, usually around 0.1%, but sometimes up to about 1% nickel. Where it's a little coarser grained and a little bit less strongly brecciated, that picrite looks like this. And as you go into this more coherent material, as I mentioned, there's a lot more alteration. this rock starts to get a really distinctive patchy, blotchy appearance. The company geologists log this as the gray rock. I called it the blotchy green rock. And in thin section, you can see that it's a mixture of tremolite, carbonate, plagioclase, and biotite, and there's quite a lot of carbonate addition, carbonate alteration in this material. And you can see it is still somewhat fractured. There's biotite growth in some of the openings, and there's quite a lot of the sulfide has come in along these fractures as well. And then right in the core of these thicker bodies, there's very intense alteration. It's brecciated into sort of larger chunks. So this is a little bit of the pyroxenitic, metapyroxenite in the core of this presumably flow, with these big veins cutting through it with sort of ductile looking margins. And the veins are mostly made of plagioclase with some tremolite, surprising amount of leucoxene or titanite, some biotite on the margins again, and quite a bit of pyrite and pentlandite. So very strong carbonate alteration in the mafic clasts, and then these plagioclase, carbonate, tremolite veins cutting across, carrying the sulfides. And then the ultramafic rock that I pointed out on the section at the bottom of the system looks like this. In core, you can see that it's a talc carbonate schist. It's very flaky, with some chloride in it that turns it quite dark in color. And in thin section, you can see that it's very, very strongly deformed, with some relict spinel grains that probably were chromite. And then there's this material here, which is a very fine-grained ultramafic rock that's got around 30% MgO, and which I think probably is a komatiite chilled margin on these things, which look like granitic cumulates from the same thing. But everything is so strained here that I can't really be sure about much. I don't have a lot of geochemical data. We did analyze a few rocks, and I'll show you a little, but really I just want to show a plausible explanation for the compositions of the rocks that we see. You can put together on a diagram like this. This is mole percent FeO versus mole percent MgO. That very fine-grained ultramafic body that I showed you plots right here at around 30 mole percent MgO. So that looks like a komatiite to me. And then those ultramafic talc carbonate schists plot over here, and they're plausibly related to this komatiite by accumulation of olivine like this, which is calculated using the old Roeder and Emsley model from this liquid. And if you fractionate that olivine out of this liquid, then you get to a residual melt composition like this. And these blue circles are the least altered and least mineralized samples I could find of that brecciated picritic basalt. Some of that breccia also shows some evidence of accumulation of olivine. So this is the olivine that would crystallize from those picrites. And so these samples here may just have accumulated a bit of that olivine. And then the rocks that I showed you with all of that carbonate flooding and plagioclase and biotite veining are trending off down this way through this alteration process, which obviously involves some loss of iron and magnesium. And
Jim, 2 minutes max?
Sure. Yeah, I'm almost done here.
Okay.
This is the trace element profile of that komatiite. It seems to be missing a bit of strontium, and it's had some addition of uranium and thorium, but basically it looks like a depleted mantle-derived magma. The picrite is sitting here. It's a little more fractionated. And I just want to point out here that alteration, although some of these nominally immobile elements are still down in the sort of picrite range of concentrations, there's been massive addition of rare earth elements, so lutetium, europium, samarium, etc. So there's probably been some secondary growth of a mineral like monazite. So we don't have a petrogenetic model for this deposit. There are some systems that seem vaguely similar to it in the literature. This is one from the year Urals, which is a nickel-bearing VMS system on the margins of a carbonate-altered peridotite massif. I really don't have any idea how these veins formed. Obviously, there's a local source of nickel in these altered ultramafic rocks, and presumably the nickel has been transported short distances and deposited into the breccia. There's no evidence for magmatic sulfides in the system. So if anybody's seen something like this, I'd be happy to hear from you. And that's all that we have to say about this deposit.